in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
We now go over to Claudia Webb. Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government keeps saying that this virus doesn't discriminate, but that isn't true. The Office for National Statistics, the ONS figures show Black people, African and African Caribbean people are 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19. It is also disproportionately high for Bangladeshi, Pakistani or Indian communities. What is the Prime Minister going to do now about this? And will he act now to ensure African, Asian and minority ethnic communities in Leicester East and across the country are supported in the next phase of this virus?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Lady may know, we are looking at all the comorbidities associated with coronavirus, all the reasons why people may be disproportionately affected, and a rapid review is now being conducted by Professor Fenton, who will report at the end of the month about particularly vulnerable groups, and we will be taking steps to ensure that they are protected where that is appropriate.
Richard Hull.
Mr. Speaker, and today I submitted a formal expression of interest for a new rail line between Concert and the Metro Centre, connecting my constituency to the heart of the North East in Newcastle. As part of the Levelling Up agenda, can I ask the Prime Minister for his support in this scheme, as my constituents have supported him and me?
Prime Minister.
Can I congratulate my honourable friend on his imagination and his plan for a new a railway, and it is entirely in keeping with our infrastructure revolution, and I can assure him that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, will be getting back to him. I noticed that Nexus have already identified several possible extensions of the time and where metro scheme, Mr. Speaker, which may be of advantage for his constituents.
We now come to Leader of Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, the Health Secretary said that right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes. That caused quite a reaction. Yesterday, it was flatly contradicted by the Chief Executive of Care England. He was giving evidence to the Health Select Committee, and he said we should have been focusing on care homes from the start. Despite that, this is his evidence, despite what is being said, there were cases of people who either didn't have a COVID status or were symptomatic who were discharged into our care homes. The government advice from the 2nd to the 15th of April was that, and I quote, negative tests are not required prior to transfers or admissions into care homes. What's protective about that?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows full well, of course, he's right to draw attention to what has happened in our care homes, and we mourn the loss of every victim. But no one was discharged into a care home this year without the express authorization of a clinician. And as I pointed out to him, who have the interests of those patients at heart, and as I said to him last week, which he doesn't seem to have remembered, actually the number of patients discharged from hospitals into care homes was 40% down in March on January. The guidance was changed to reflect the change in the epidemic, and that guidance was made available to care homes. And of course, since the Care Homes Action Plan began, we have seen a sharp reduction in the numbers of deaths in care homes, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, since I last stood before this House, the number of deaths in care homes has come down by 31%. And I think he should pay tribute to all those who have helped to fight that epidemic across the NHS and across our local services.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Prime Minister rather missed the point. The question was whether people were tested going back into care homes. And the Chief Executive of Care England says that because they weren't, people who had no COVID-19 status or who were symptomatic were discharged into care homes. That's a very serious issue that requires an answer. Yesterday, the Chief Executive of Care England, in his evidence, was also asked when routine testing would start in care homes. This is the answer he gave yesterday. I think the short answer is that we've had the announcement, but what we haven't had is delivery. and we are not really clear when that will arrive. This is the Chief Executive of Care England in his evidence. Even the government's command paper, published last week and introduced by the Prime Minister to this House, says within it, the command paper, I'm quoting now, the Health Secretary says he's wrong, quoting the government's paper, every care home for the over 65s will have been offered testing for residents and staff by the 6th of June. That's from the Prime Minister's command paper. That's over 2 weeks away. What's causing the continued delay in routine testing in our care homes?
I'm Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid he's simply in ignorance of the facts, because the reality is that already 125,000 care home staff have been tested. 118,000, perhaps he didn't know that, Mr. Speaker, 118,000 care home workers have been tested, and we are absolutely confident that we will be able to increase our testing, not just in care homes, but across the whole of the community. And thanks to the hard work of my right honourable friend and his teams, we will get up to 200,000 tests in this country by the end of this month. And he may know, perhaps it's one of those statistics, international comparisons he hesitates to make, but actually this country is now testing more than virtually any other country in Europe.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, again, the question was when routine testing would start, and the Chief Executive of Care England, who knows what he's talking about, gave evidence yesterday that it hasn't. If the Prime Minister is disputing the evidence of the Select Committee, that's his own business.
Order. Secretary of State for Health, please. I don't mind you advising the Prime Minister, but you don't need to advise the opposition during this. Do you want to lead the chamber on maximum numbers? If you want to give way to somebody else, I'm more than happy. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, and to assure the Prime Minister, I'm not expressing my own view. I'm putting to him the evidence of experts to committees yesterday. Testing, as referred to by the Prime Minister, that on its own is obviously not enough. What's needing is testing, tracing and isolation. At yesterday's press conference, the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor said that we could draw particular lessons from Germany and South Korea, which have both had intensive testing and tracing. The number of COVID-19 deaths in Germany stands at around 8,000. In South Korea, it's under 300. In contrast, in the United Kingdom, despite 2 million tests having been carried out, there's been no effective tracing in place since March the 12th, when tracing was abandoned. That's nearly 10 weeks in a critical period without effective tracing. That's a huge hole in our defences, isn't it, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I must say that I find it peculiar, because I've given the right honourable gentleman repeated briefings on this matter and many others. He's perfectly aware of the situation in the UK as regards testing and tracing in early March. It's been explained many times to him and to the House. But what I can tell him, and I think his sort of feigned ignorance really doesn't come very well, but what I can tell him is that today I am confident that we will have a test and trace operation that will enable us, if all the other conditions are satisfied, and it is entirely provisional, that will enable us to make progress. And I can tell him also that by the 1st of June, already we've recruited 24,000 trackers, and by the 1st of June we will have 25,000. They will be capable of tracking the contacts of 10,000 new cases a day. And to understand the importance of that statistic, I should just remind him that today the new cases stand at 2,400. So we're making vast progress in testing and tracing, and I have great confidence that by June the 1st we will have a system that will enable us, will help us very greatly to defeat this disease and move the country forward. And I hope, therefore, that he will abandon his slightly negative tone and support it.
Keir Starmer.
34,000 deaths isn't negative. Is negative. Of course I'm going to ask about that. And quite right too. The Prime Minister knows, he says feigned ignorance. For 10 weeks, there's been no tracing. unlike Germany and South Korea. And tracing is critical. There's no getting away from that. There's no getting away from it. The Prime Minister knows it's absolutely vital. He made a great deal of it in his speech to the nation Sunday week ago. He said we cannot move forward unless we satisfy the test that he's set, one of which is test, a world-beating test and trace system. World-beating. Leaving aside the rhetoric, effective will do, there now appears to be some doubt as to when this is actually going to be ready. This is the last PMQs for 2 weeks. Can the Prime Minister indicate that an effective test, trace and isolate system will be in place by the 1st of June, Monday week?
Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman seems to be in the unhappy position of having rehearsed his third or fourth question without having listened to my previous answer. I've a brilliant forensic mind though he doubtless is. What he has heard is that we have a growing confidence that we will have a test, track and trace operation that will be world-beating, and yes, it will be in place. It will be in place by June the 1st. And just to repeat the figure, since he's invited me to do so, there will be 25,000 trackers. They will be able to cope with 10,000 new cases a day. And that's very, very important, because currently new cases are running at about 2,500 a day. They'll be able to trace the contacts of those new cases and to stop the disease spreading. And what I hope very much is that, notwithstanding the occasional difficulty of these exchanges, and I totally appreciate the role that he has to fulfill, that he will support us as we go forward, that he will be positive about this test, track and trace operation, and that we can work together to use it to take our country forward, because that is what I think the people of this country want to see.
Keir Starmer.
I'm very happy to work with the Prime Minister on that. He knows that from our previous exchanges. Mr. Speaker, every Thursday we go out and clap for our carers. Many of them are risking their lives for the sakes of all of us. Does the Prime Minister think that it's right that care workers coming from abroad and working on our front line should have to pay a surcharge of hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds to use the NHS themselves?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thought a great deal about this, and I do accept and I do understand the difficulties faced by our amazing NHS staff, and like him, I've been a personal beneficiary of people who've come from, carers who've come from abroad and frankly saved my life. So I know exactly the importance of what he says. But on the other hand, we must look at the realities that this is a great national service, it's a national institution, it needs funding, and those contributions actually help us to raise about £900 million, and it's very difficult in the current circumstances to find alternative sources. So with great respect to the point that he makes, I do think that that is the right way forward.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm disappointed because the Prime Minister just knows how raw this is. The fee in question, the immigration health surcharge, is currently £400 a year. From October, that goes up to £624 a year. For a care worker on the national living wage, that will require working for 70 hours to pay off the fee. The Doctors Association, a number of medical groups, wrote to the Home Secretary this week, and they set it out this way. At a time when we're mourning colleagues, your steadfast refusal to reconsider the deeply unfair immigration health surcharge is a gross insult to all of us who are serving this country at its time of greatest need. We agree, and Labour will table an amendment to the immigration bill to exempt NHS and care workers from this charge. Can I urge the Prime Minister to reconsider his view as we go through this crisis?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've given my answer, but what I will say is that I think that it is important that we support our NHS and that we invest massively in our NHS, and this government, this one nation government, Conservative government, is determined to invest more in our NHS at any time in modern memory. We've already begun that, and we will want to see our fantastic frontline workers paid properly, and that is, I think, the best way forward. I want to see our NHS staff paid properly, our NHS supported, and I want to continue our programme, not just of building 40 more hospitals, but recruiting 50,000 more nurses and investing hugely in our NHS. And I believe that will be warmly welcomed across the whole of our establishment of our fantastic NHS.
Yeah. We're going to lovely Lancashire with Sarah Britliff. Sarah Britliff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Looking at the economic recovery process, I'm sure the Prime Minister will join me in thanking CELRAT for the continuous campaign to reopen the Skipton to Colne railway line, of which it's been confirmed that plans will be moving forward. It's also great news that the potential of the freight terminal is being considered, but can the Prime Minister assure me that Hyndburn and Haslingden will continue to be supported by potential investment in our town centres, business and transport links that we so desperately need?
Minister.
Indeed I can, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable from Hyndburn and Haslingden will indeed continue to receive funding for their town centres. Indeed, the High Straits Task Force will be increasing that support, in addition to 118 kilometres of safe new green cycleways and thanks to the Lancashire Local Growth Fund, for which I know she has also campaigned.
We go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. He's rather dark today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our thoughts this morning are with communities in India and Bangladesh in dealing with the landfall of Super Cyclone Amphan. I'm sure the government will be monitoring the situation and will seek to give all necessary support. Mr. Speaker, every week members of this government applaud our truly heroic NHS and care staff. They have been on the front line of this pandemic, regardless of whether they were born here or born elsewhere. Indeed, the Prime Minister has thanked the nurses who cared for him, who were from New Zealand and from Portugal. Mr. Speaker, the UK has the highest number of deaths in Europe, and without their sacrifice, we would be facing something much, much worse. Now, I know the Leader of the Opposition has already asked the Prime Minister about overseas care workers, but on Monday, the Prime Minister ordered his MPs to vote for an immigration bill that defines many in the NHS and care sector as low-skilled workers. Given their sacrifice, Prime Minister, is he not embarrassed that this is how his government chooses to treat NHS and care workers?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is a government that values immensely the work of everybody in our National Health Service, in our care workers, and across the whole community. And I can tell him that the reason for having an immigration bill of the kind that we are is not to keep out people who can help in our NHS. On the contrary, we want an immigration system that works for the people of this country and works for our NHS. And I think what the people of this country want to see is an immigration system where we control it and we understand it and we are able to direct it according to the needs of our NHS and the needs of our economy. And that's what we are putting in place. And I know it's rejected by the right honourable gentleman opposite, but and indeed by himself, but it is the right way forward.
Returning to Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, the harsh reality is that the Prime Minister doesn't even pay NHS and care staff the real living wage, and he wants to block many of them from working here at all. We need an immigration system that is fit for purpose. The Home Secretary and the Prime Minister seem hell-bent on implementing a purely ideological immigration policy with no basis in fairness or economics. This government has talked about giving back to our NHS and care staff. Well, it's time for the Prime Minister to deliver. People migrating to these nations and choosing to work in our NHS and our care sector must have this government's cruel NHS surcharge removed, and removed immediately. Will the Prime Minister make that pledge today? Or will he clap on Thursday, hoping that no one really notices that he's giving with one hand and raking it in with the other?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, he mentions the living wage. This is the party, the government that instituted the living wage and now has just increased it by a massive amount. Secondly, this is the party that is putting more into the NHS, £34 billion, the biggest investment in modern times, and it will, believe me, we will continue with that investment. And I would just, he talks about discriminatory policies at the border. The logic of his policies, Mr. Speaker, is to have a border at Berwick.
We're now going down to Dorset to Richard Drax. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Defence Select Committee heard recently that France is conducting a root and branch review of its defence supply chain, following concerns that China is buying up defence-related companies that are going bust during this pandemic. Does my right honourable friend think it might be wise to consider doing the same thing here, in addition to rowing back from his plans to allow Huawei to roll out 5G?
Prime Minister.
I'm sure there's a legal term for the imputing of a policy to me that I've not yet announced by my honourable friend. What I will say is he's absolutely right to be concerned about investment, to be concerned about the buying up of UK technology now by countries that may not always may have ulterior motives, and we are certainly bringing forward measures to ensure that we protect our technological base, and I'm happy, and he'll be hearing a lot more about that in the next few weeks.
Heading to Northern Ireland with Colm Eastwood. Colm Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Ireland, both jurisdictions are working hard to organise contact tracing on a north-south basis. But the Prime Minister's obsession with avoiding a Brexit transition extension means we are critically risking crashing out without a data sharing framework. This will critically undermine our ability to protect people from COVID-19. When will he put the lives of people in our community above the petty, narrow Brexiteer politics?
Prime Minister.
I must respectfully disagree with the honourable gentleman. We are working very closely, not just with our colleagues in the government in Northern Ireland, but also with our colleagues in Dublin. I had a very good conversation with Leo Varadkar the other day, and we saw eye to eye on the way forward. There's a huge amount shared between the UK and Ireland, and it will continue to be so.
Heading down to the South Coast, Caroline Nansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a stunning coastal destination built on hospitality and tourism sectors hard hit by the impact of the virus, Eastbourne is nonetheless looking to bounce back when it's safe to do so, and is part of work on a COVID-secure kite mark to inspire public confidence. Does my right honourable friend see merit in this? And when the coast is clear, would he visit?
Prime Minister.
I'm sure the coast is always clear at Eastbourne. I will do my utmost to get there as soon as I can within the social distancing rules that we must all observe. But her idea of, I think, we'll look at the kite mark idea. I think the best I can say is that she's a fantastic champion for Eastbourne and its attractions, and I look forward to supporting her in any way that I can.
Rosie Duffy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women make up the vast majority of the workforce in our NHS, social care sector and our schools. However, there's only a handful of women on the SAGE committee, and only one woman in the Cabinet has led the Downing Street briefing in the last 8 weeks on a very few occasions. Does the Prime Minister agree with me, as the chair of the largest group of female MPs in this House, that we need a change of tone and more female voices at the top of government to reflect the majority of the UK population, almost 52% of whom are in fact women? And if not, why not?
Minister.
Actually, I think that she has an extremely important point, and I've taken dramatic action even before a reshuffle, and so the two most important appointments we've made recently after Lord Dighton doing the PPE was Dido. One of the reasons we're making such fast progress, I think, now on test and trace is that Dido Harding has come on board, and Kate Bingham is leading the national effort to coordinate our search for a vaccine with other countries.
Chris London.
Good question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful for my right honourable friend's hard work, in particular his commitment to do whatever it takes to help people make ends meet during this pandemic. But in West Dorset, I have many constituents who were employed before the 19th of March, but who are not eligible to be furloughed under the job retention scheme, particularly those who have changed jobs. So can I ask my right honourable friend to look at this area again to see, please, what he can do to help those who have slipped through the net and those who have no financial support at this time?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate it's hard. I mean, we have pushed back the cut-off date in order to help people, but we're also looking to support people who are in difficulties with some temporary measures on welfare. As he knows, the significant £1,040 increase in universal credit standard allowance and working tax credit basic element. But if there are particularly hard cases, and there will be hard cases, can I say what I've said before to the House, that I'm happy to take them up on his behalf.
Going to north of the border with Alan Dorrans. Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister condemn or condone the reckless behaviour of the Secretary of State for Scotland for making a round trip of almost 700 miles to be physically in the chamber today, in clear breach of the guidance of the Scottish Government to stay home, protect the NHS and save lives, when he could easily have taken part in the proceedings virtually from the safety of his home? Condemn or condone, Prime Minister?
Minister.
All I can say is no, Mr. Speaker. I won't, and I think that the Secretary of State of Scotland does an admirable job.
Yeah. Going over to Tom Randall. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Elizabeth Gould has proposed the creation of a medal for NHS workers and others to recognise their distinguished service in their work against coronavirus. I think this idea has merit. Will my right honourable friend consider a medal or other accolade in the fullness of time for those who have gone above and beyond in the last few months?
Prime Minister.
As I'm sure the whole House can imagine, we are indeed looking at the excellent suggestion made by my honourable friend's constituent, Elizabeth. We are thinking how to recognise the work of healthcare staff, of carers, of many others, and we're engaging with staff and employers at the present time.
We now head to Marion Fellows, north of the border. Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A senior government figure told the Sunday Times reporter that the UK government will end the job retention scheme even if the Scottish government decides to continue with the lockdown to save lives in Scotland. This would be an act from the UK government to undermine devolution and the Scottish Parliament by slashing incomes to force Scots back to work when it's potentially unsafe. Will the Prime Minister agree to extend the job retention scheme in Scotland for the length of time Scotland's government and Parliament deem a lockdown necessary?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps I can just say that I continue to be very happy with the level of cooperation, in spite of what you sometimes hear in this chamber, the level of cooperation between the governments of all four nations, particularly Scotland. I just remind her, of course, that Scotland has benefited from about £1 billion of coronavirus funding in the last period, and £3 billion, and we'll get about £3 billion overall, which is perhaps a material consideration on which she might like to reflect.
Lucy Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unemployment in the under 24 age group has already doubled in Telford compared to this time last year, and it's clear that the aftermath of the pandemic will hit our young people hardest, with disruption to education and training as well as job losses. I know that my right honourable friend is passionate about opportunities for young people, particularly in areas such as Telford, which has suffered disproportionately in previous recessions. Will he ensure that the recovery strategy focuses on young people and equipping them with the skills they need to survive in a post-pandemic economy and indeed thrive in the longer term?
Prime Minister.
She's absolutely right to speak up for the young people of Telford and their immense potential, and that's why we'll be supporting her and them with a new national skills fund worth £2.5 billion, so that young people can be at the very forefront of our effort to come out of this epidemic.
That's the end of PMQs. Before the urgent question, I should say that I plan to allow a statement by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster on the UK's approach to Northern Ireland Protocol as part of the scrutiny proceedings. I will allow less time for the urgent question and the business statement in consequence. We now come to the urgent question to the Leader of the House. I will end the urgent question at 12:55. I call the Leader of the House, Mr Jacob Mogg, to answer the urgent question from Alistair Carmichael as on the order paper. The Leader of the House should speak for no more than 3 minutes. Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, may I first recognise your commitment to ensuring the House operates as fully as it can while adhering to guidance from Public Health England. Your dedication and that of the House clerks and digital team has been instrumental in establishing the hybrid proceedings that allowed us to return after Easter. But, Mr Speaker, as you have always agreed, the present arrangements were only ever envisaged as temporary because they fundamentally restrict the House's ability to perform its functions fully. Complaints about our debate becoming stilted, scripted affairs are one thing, and the impact on legislative scrutiny is another. Under the hybrid proceedings, the time this House is able to spend debating legislation faces being cut by around 2/3. I am sure all members will agree that each and every one of the 36 bills put forward by the government in the Queen's speech deserves the proper level of scrutiny. We have to recognise that if we persist with the present arrangements, it will become harder to make progress in a timely fashion. That is why, in line with government advice for those who cannot do their jobs from home, I am asking members to return to their place of work after Whitsun. We will not be returning to the crowded, bustling chamber of old. We will be observing social distancing. As a member of the House of Commons Commission, I was reassured yesterday by the progress being made in making the parliamentary estate a COVID-19 secure workplace. This work has been expertly led by Marianne Sinarski, the Head of Governance and Central Services, and I particularly commend her for her efforts to ensure that staff already coming in to work in the Palace have the support they need. Only yesterday, Mr Speaker, you organised the test of a new system for divisions that will ensure members can vote whilst remaining 6 feet apart. We will minimise the number of other pass holders on the estate, strongly encouraging MP staff and others to continue working from home. And we will continue to work closely together in consultation with members across the House, not least the Procedure Committee, on the appropriate next steps. We will need to understand from the House authorities where adaptations can be implemented, as the Procedure Committee itself acknowledges is key, without prejudice to the House's ability to carry out its business effectively. At the same time, we will want to ensure that any steps taken are in line with the government's advice to the country at large. I will consider the Procedure Committee's views very carefully and keep these issues under the review, but I would finally like to reassure those members with underlying health conditions who have been told to shield or are receiving specific government advice about their health that we are working with the House authorities to see how they can continue to contribute to proceedings within the House.
I will now call Alistair Carmichael, who is asked to speak for no more than 2 minutes. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for allowing this urgent question. Mr Speaker, I do not want this debate today to be all about members of Parliament. Let us remember what has brought us to this point. Yesterday, the number of recorded deaths from COVID-19 reached 35,341, a rise of 545 from the day before. Today, the government's response to that is to insist that members of Parliament should undertake non-essential journeys, in my case, almost the entire length of this country, to stay in second homes. Something which, when done by leading government advisors, led to their resignation. If ever there was a case of do as I say and not as I do, then this is it. Mr Speaker, none of us is blind to the inadequacies of online scrutiny. Like many members, I find it to be stilted and artificial. But if it is a choice between that and putting the safety of members, their families and the staff of this House at risk, then that is no choice at all, and it should end only when it is safe to do so, and safe for all members, not just those who live within driving distance of Westminster. As trade union representatives explained to the Commission yesterday, the House of Commons is supported by approximately 3,000 employees. Is the leader really satisfied that we can bring MPs back on the 2nd of June while discharging our duty of care towards them? How many of them will be able to return to work without risk to themselves or those with whom they live. It is widely reported that the motivation for this over-hasty return is to get a support act behind the Prime Minister on Wednesday afternoons. It's even reported today that the leader yesterday suggested to the Commons Commission that to get more MPs in, perspex screens should be installed between the benches, between members. Someone has obviously told him how things are being done in Tesco these days. Mr. Speaker, we have demonstrated in recent weeks that the business of this House can be done from behind a screen, as we do right now, from behind a computer screen, not from behind a screen of perspex, the only purpose of which is to shield the government from scrutiny and the Prime Minister from ridicule. The Leader of the House must think again.
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the point the right honourable gentleman was making about Prime Minister's questions is a fundamentally trivial one and beneath him, and therefore I shall ignore it. And I am very sorry that the right honourable gentleman doesn't think that proper scrutiny of the government is an essential task in a democracy. I think this is an extraordinary position for a former member of a government to take, and a leading figure, if the Liberal Party has leading figures, but a leading figure in the Liberal Party, to take. That democratic accountability is fundamental to how our system works. The right honourable gentleman from his area in the Shetland Islands tells us that a remote system doesn't work well enough, and then he says we should nonetheless continue with it. I think we have a duty of members of Parliament to return to doing our work thoroughly and properly and effectively, and that is what we will do in line with the government advice and the 5 tests and ensuring a safe working environment. And I would reiterate my thanks to Marianne Snarski for what she has done, because people working in the House, the employees of the House, are able to work safely, and the numbers expected to come in is not thought likely to rise significantly when the House returns at Whitsun.
We've just lost the next member, so I'm going to go straight to Valerie Vance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland and you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. I just want to say to the Leader of the House that was a fantastic performance last week about democracy and parliamentary sovereignty. It was all style and no substance. If this wasn't so serious, I would have nominated him for a BAFTA. But, Mr. Speaker, we have had a joint commission with the other place, and at a commission meeting, we have had a briefing from Public Health England. Before his unilateral declaration that the government will not renew the temporary hybrid proceedings, did he have a discussion with Public Health England? What was their advice, and will he publish it? Can I correct him again? He keeps saying that if others are going to work, the government expects us to go to work. We are at work. We are at work at all times, and the government's own advice is if you can work from home, then do so. That's still the government's advice on grounds of working and travelling safely. So can he confirm he is not contradicting government advice and say how members are expected to travel down when there is a reduced service? Now, Mr. Speaker, everyone knows someone who's been a victim of this disease, and not just suffering, but actually died. This isn't a bounce-back virus, as the Prime Minister said, or the survival of the fittest. We have a diverse workforce and the community in our community here, which we encourage. So what risk assessment has he asked to be made to ensure that members and the extra House staff required for return can return safely? Can the Leader confirm that on returning to physical-only proceedings, that proper social distancing measures have been worked out and are sustainable in the chamber? And what was the extra waiting time for voting at the practice voting? This is not, Mr. Speaker, a battle of government good and everyone else bad, of shirkers versus workers, as some ministers have said. This is about Parliament being a good model employer. We need a phased return, not to overpower the NHS or overpower House staff, where everyone can be safe. And finally, can the Leader confirm that the parliamentary estate is COVID-free? And does he agree with the scientific advice that it is about observed levels of infection and not about a fixed date?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, most of those questions were actually answered at the commission that we had on Tuesday, which the right honourable lady is a member of, but unfortunately may not because of a dodgy connection, we could hardly hear her during the proceedings of the Commission, and perhaps she couldn't hear all the points that were made, because we had reassurance from the House authorities that, yes, this will be a COVID-19 secure workplace by the time we come back after the Whitsun recess, that a risk assessment has been carried out by the parliamentary authorities, and the enormous steps that are being taken to help and to assist parliamentary staff. So what is the House doing? Well, there is extra cleaning going on. These same mechanisms will be used to clean pads as are used on the London Underground to try and ensure that there is safety that the congestion charge is being paid for members of staff so that they can drive in, and the parking under Abingdon Gardens is being made available. Considerable steps have been made by the House authorities, as the Right Honourable Lady knows, to ensure that it is safe to work here. And is this in line with government advice? Yes, of course it is. The key question, Mr. Speaker, for Honourable and Right Honourable members to ask themselves is, do they think that proper scrutiny and proper legislative processes are essential? If they are, we need to be here. If they're not, they can work remotely. It seems to me unquestionably that those proper processes are an essential part of our country functioning, and therefore we cannot do our jobs properly from home, and therefore that is in line with the government's advice.
We're going to Selene Saxby. Selene Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for the work being done to ensure that Parliament is a safe working environment for all. But does he agree with me that whilst we have had to improvise due to the unprecedented situation we find ourselves in, we cannot effectively do our jobs from home? We should lead by example when asking the country to return to work, and we could improvise further in Westminster, for example, by taking advantage of more of the space available to enable more of us to participate fully and safely.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's advice is clear: work from home if you can. But what I and many others have increasingly realised is that this House cannot work effectively without meeting physically. Take last week, for example. No debates on secondary legislation, no public bill committees, no delegated legislation committees. Compare that to a fairly standard and not particularly busy physical sitting week, such as the week commencing the 2nd of March. That week, the Commons considered the stages of 4 bills instead of 1, and 9 SIs instead of none. In addition to chamber time, the House held 7 delegated legislation committees and 4 public bill committee meetings. I therefore very much welcome my honourable friend's valuable point that MPs' work is absolutely essential, and indeed that we cannot do it from home.
I will now call Thomas Shepherd, the SNP spokesperson, who is asked to speak for no more than 1 minute. Thomas Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The position taken by the Leader of the House is reckless, cavalier, and downright dangerous. Surely it is his job to make sure that elected members can represent the views of their constituents. Yet he now proposes to force members to make a choice between standing up for those who elected them and putting their own health and the health of others at risk. The Leader talks of an ancient right to enter Parliament. But what good is that right if it cannot be executed without endangering the lives of one's family and constituents? Switching off the computer and barring members from participating online will reduce the ability of members of Parliament to scrutinise the government. It is simply Orwellian to pretend that it will enhance it. Moreover, this will not affect everyone equally. Those who are older and suffer ill health will be disproportionately affected, as will those who live farthest away. So can I ask, has he undertaken an equalities assessment of this proposal, and does he think that removing the existing arrangements is compatible with the laws on equality of treatment of persons in the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, may I draw the honourable gentleman's attention to some remarks I made some moments ago when I said I would like to reassure those members with underlying health conditions who have been told to shield or are receiving specific government advice about their health that we are working with the House authorities to see how they can continue to contribute to proceedings within the House. And we recognise the importance of that, but we also recognise the need for business to continue. I understand that the Parliament in Holyrood is still meeting, though with a third of members turning up, moving all over Scotland to get there. So I slightly think what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
We go to Bill Esterson. Bill Esterson.
If the Speaker of the House thinks this is safe,
He's trying to kid everyone and he's fooling no one. It's the members of Parliament who have underlying health conditions. It's those over 70 who absolutely should not be going anywhere. It's those of us who have family members with underlying health conditions, and it's our staff who have those same challenges to face as well. How on earth, with so many members with underlying health conditions, age, or family members who are at risk, can this possibly be right? Can it possibly be democratic? And can possibly our constituents all be represented properly?
I presume it means the leader, not the speaker.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker.
Well, you did say speaker, not leader. Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the issue is that members of staff of MPs do not need to come in. They clearly can carry on working from home. There is no change there. Numbers coming onto the estate will be limited. But what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that we are facing exactly the same issues as other workplaces where working from home is not good enough. These are not unique to us. We are in the same situation as the rest of the nation. And we shouldn't think that members of Parliament are some special priestly caste who must be treated differently. We should stand with our own constituents.
Going to Chris Grayling. Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the comments of the Leader of the House? It is very clear to me that though the House authorities have done a fantastic job in seeing us through the last few weeks, this is not a sustainable way to run Parliament in the future. But I seek my right honourable friend's reassurance that this model, which some people seem to think can be a model for the future, will not now be applied to projects like restoration and renewal, which in my view would again create a situation where Parliament simply could not function properly.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend who has such experience as a former Leader of the House and knows and understands how this place ought to work. I think the measures that we used and that we are using currently are a remarkable achievement of the House authorities in a very particular circumstance. It is very unlikely that this way of operating would be suitable to other circumstances.
Going to Liz Twist. Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just like our communities, this House is made up of people with a range of different situations, following government advice and Public Health England advice, shielding, self-isolating or with child or elder care responsibilities arising from these unique COVID circumstances, yet continuing to represent their constituents, though they can't be here in person. So can the Leader of the House tell us what arrangements will be in place to make sure that all members can continue to take part fully in the work of Parliament in person or virtually?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and the point she raises is a very serious one and one that is being considered by both my office and by the House more generally, and there are discussions that will continue over Whitsun to try and work out how those people receiving specific medical advice or being instructed to shield may be helped to participate in proceedings once we return, and how the technology may work with regard to that. But the importance of the point is one that we understand.
We go to Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the commitment from the Leader of the House to ensure those members who are vulnerable will not be disadvantaged and will be able to continue to represent their constituents in the House. Can the Leader of the House confirm that these arrangements will also be available to members who, like many working parents, rely on grandparents who might be in the vulnerable category to supplement their childcare and therefore cannot travel to Westminster at this time?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, we are listening, obviously, to the representations people are making about the difficulties that they face with regard to attending the House, and the Procedure Committee has looked at a number of these issues and written to you, Mr. Speaker, in relation to return to physical proceedings, and I've had representations from a number of members. But the reality is that Parliament is most effective when it meets physically. The hybrid parliamentary proceedings have only allowed a small proportion of Parliament's functionality to take place, and they have limited, as we see in this session with members being cut off, they have limited the ability of members to represent their constituencies across the country. But what we will do is return physically in a way advised and properly orchestrated and organised in accordance with the recommendations from the government and indeed from the House of Commons authorities.
And Public Health England. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to be called in this urgent question. I am thankful to the Leader of the House, as I know he recognises that we all have an equal duty to represent our constituents. But the travel to and from Westminster is not equal for us all. Indeed, a plane from Belfast is not as socially distant as we would like. So I would ask the Leader of the House to consider the most vexatious issue, the most difficult issue to solve, which will be voting, and whether remote voting can continue, given that the ability to travel to and from Westminster from Northern Ireland is severely constrained with less than 2 planes per day, when ordinarily there would have been over 20 from Northern Ireland to London.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue with voting, as you yourself have made clear, Mr. Speaker, is that we can run one system or the other, that the two systems are not compatible, and we are looking to a physical return of the House and therefore to have physical voting. And I think that is important, an important way of getting back to being a normal Parliament with all the benefits that come from having physical voting.
We're now going to try and reconnect Karen Bradley, Chair of Procedure. Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm audio only, I'm afraid. But can I thank my right honourable friend for his answer? And can I also say that I firmly believe, as Chair of the Procedure Committee, that the House should be allowed to have its say on these changes. And it is important that an opportunity is given for the House to do that. Could I ask the Leader of the House, though, if he can reflect on the resolution that the House passed on the 21st of April, which stays in place while Public Health England advice remains, and which allows for both virtual participation and for parity of treatment for all members. Could I ask the Leader, is he intending to amend or rescind that resolution, or does he believe it no longer applies?
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for the invaluable work she and her committee have been doing and the suggestions that they have come forward with as to how we make the hybrid work and how we get back to a real Parliament. And we see in her absence the difficulties with a hybrid Parliament, that I'm glad that the technology was able to reconnect her in voice only, but being here in the flesh does have advantages. As regards the motion of the House stands, but it requires subsidiary motions for which will lapse to allow it to be effective. And of course the government takes motions of the House very seriously and ensures and wishes to ensure that the details of motions of the House are reflected in the way that the House operates, though sometimes these are more matters for Mr. Speaker than they are for the Leader of the House.
We're going to Jill Gideon. Jill Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to hear that the Leader of the House has announced measures are going to be considered to protect the MPs who have been shielding or carrying out caring responsibilities of vulnerable family members who are at high risk of coronavirus. Can I ask my right honourable friend if we can be advised of what the new measures will be in advance of people making the decision as to whether they can come back early or not?
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You almost promoted me. I will continue, as will others across the House, to listen and to reflect on the views of honourable and right honourable members from across the House. Yesterday afternoon, the Procedure Committee wrote to me and the Speaker to set out its views on how we should return to physical proceedings. And I welcome the opportunity for further discussions with that committee on Monday, and I'm grateful for its work. And I've also had representations from many other members. So this is a work in progress to finalise the details, but any changes in our procedures will need to be made by motion in this House, and those can't be made until the House meets again. So the assumption must be that we continue as we usually continue until such time as or if anything changes.
We'll have to be very quick. Steve Bonner, last.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Across Scotland, we are dissuading people from travelling large distances for fear of spreading the virus further and overloading rural communities. Does the leader understand that there is real concerns beyond threatening the safety of MPs that by removing votes unless we are physically present, insisting we return to that place, this will undoubtedly undermine the public safety message, and that has been key to preventing even wider spread of the COVID in our communities? Thank you.
Leader of the House.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what is being proposed for the House is completely in line with what is being proposed by the government generally. It is a question of working through the 5 tests. It is a question of those who can go back to work because they cannot work effectively from home are encouraged to go back to work. We are in the same situation as everybody else, and measures are being taken, have been taken, will continue to be taken to ensure that coming to the House of Commons is as safe as it possibly can be.
We now come to the business statement. I will now call the Leader of the House to make a business statement. I will run this statement until 1:20. Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the business for the week commencing the 1st of June will include Monday, the 1st of June, the House will not be sitting. Tuesday, the 2nd of June, second reading of the Parliamentary Constituencies Bill. Wednesday, the 3rd of June, consideration of a business of the House motion, followed by all stages of the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill. Thursday, the 4th of June, remaining stages of the Sentencing Pre-Consolidation Amendments Bill, Lords, followed by a debate on a motion relating to the EU's mandate for negotiating a new partnership with the UK. Friday, the 5th of June, the House will not be sitting.
Now call Valerie Vals with up to 5 minutes. Valerie Vals.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Leader for the business statement. And there we are. We're sitting up until Thursday with a hybrid virtual Parliament, so it can be done. But I just wanted to ask the Leader to start with, can he ensure that the government makes a statement on the guidance of people returning to work on the first day back, people returning to work here safely on the first day back? So the advice from the scientists is that lockdown should not be eased until track and trace is in place, and that observed levels of infection, that we look at the observed levels of infection and not just the fixed date. But does he agree that even the testing hasn't been got right, and that the government have extended it? Can the Leader say whether there are enough home tests for the House and whether there are enough masks that will be available? And I too here want to pay tribute to Marianne Snarski and everybody on the House staff who has worked so hard to keep us safe. But like the Leader's outburst last week, that came with no consultation. What our teachers want is a discussion, time to prepare. They've had a confused message because the BMA have said the children are not safe to go back. Let's remember that teachers have been at work looking after our children now, looking after key workers' children. They are the best people to say whether they're ready or not. And the government can't compare this country to Denmark because Denmark haven't had as many deaths as we have had here. So what advice has the government given to teachers, particularly on the inflammatory disease that is affecting children? And given there was a poll of almost 30,000 members of the NASUWT, which found just 5% said the schools were safe to return, 81% of parents said they don't want to send their children back, can we have an urgent statement from the Education Secretary when we return on the evidence that it was safe for children to return, given that a member of SAGE told the House of Lords Science Committee that the decision about schools was political and not based on science? Yesterday we voted on the second reading of the immigration bill, which contains swathes of Henry VIII powers. Now, the Leader is a believer of parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary democracy. I wonder if he could say if that's appropriate. But could he give a guarantee that any SIs that are prayed against by the opposition, that there will be time, in government time, for a debate? Now, Mr. Speaker, we clap our care workers into the NHS. With this immigration bill, the government is effectively clapping them out of the country. Now, my constituent is a general manager of a small and medium-sized enterprise employing 65 people. They actually indirectly support the NHS for the Nightingale hospitals, and they manufacture valuable items that people need quickly. They've had a 5-week wait and their bankers refused them a loan, just 20%. They are a profitable company. They and many other businesses are struggling to find a way to stay open. Could I urge the leader, if I can forward details onto him, could he take this up with the Chancellor, please? And last week I asked about dentists. Could he follow up with the Secretary of State? It was mentioned in the House on Monday, but we didn't get a response. The regulatory body to check PPE for dentists returning, and again, they're a small business hoping to help our country return back to normal. There is an issue about their PPE. Could he ensure that major PPE companies fast-track, and this is a powered air-filtered PPE face masks, particular to dentistry? We haven't had an answer on that. They can get back to work and protect our constituents, some of whom I think are having to pull out their own teeth. But I want to thank him last week for the response he gave me on Nazanin and Anousheh. It was very helpful, but can he ensure that the Foreign Secretary ensures that all our British citizens abroad are able to get consular visits and consular advice? No one is asking for a fanfare when the ambassador visits, but we just want him to visit Nazanin, Anousheh and Kylie, and at this time they deserve clemency, and he will know it's an important day for them today. But I want to remind all honourable members to light a candle for all of them today. And finally, Mr. Speaker, it is Epilepsy Week, and thank you for your statement on Mental Health Week. It was very helpful. Let's hope we can all encourage everyone to look out for each other.
Mr. Speaker, may I completely endorse what the Right Honourable Lady says about Epilepsy Week and mental health, that we do indeed need to look out for each other, particularly at a time of lockdown when many people are suffering, and loneliness is a particular problem and a very difficult one, particularly for people who are shielding and have to take particular care, and that this is obviously at the forefront of the government's mind. With regard to Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, consular work continues, but it's not always best to argue this on the floor of the House, if the Right Honourable Lady will forgive me for not giving more details on this occasion. To come to the more politically controversial issues, in terms of the guidance for members coming back, members will know what the national guidance is, the guidance that has been provided for people returning to work, how they should try and come back to work, what the procedures are, how they should try to distance themselves socially. They will see within the House, members who are already here, how much marking out has been done to try and help people stick to the guidelines. And the work that has been done with members of staff has been exemplary. And it is very reassuring to know that the numbers of House staff expected back, with MPs returning after Whitsun, is not expected to change significantly from the number who are currently coming in to facilitate the hybrid parliament. So the burden on our staff is not the burden is on us as members of Parliament, and therefore I think it is one that we should undertake, because we are like the rest of the country in these circumstances. The Right Honourable Lady raises questions about schools and wants a statement from the Secretary of State for Education, and he did responded to an urgent question last week, though I hope it's not indiscreet of me to say that he was himself actually very keen to make a statement, but the scheduling of statements didn't actually allow for that, so he is keen to report to Parliament and keep Parliament up to date. But there is a real issue with the widening attainment gap, with schools not being open, and that is why it is important that schools do open, if they can, in accordance with the 5 tests that the government has set out. With regard to praying against SIs, most Henry VIII powers are subject to affirmative SIs rather than to negative SIs, and therefore are subject to a process within the House automatically. But the general policy of the government, as with many previous governments, is that when SIs are prayed against by the official opposition, usually, if it is a reasonable prayer, debating time will be found. And I think that that is actually an important constitutional matter but it is also why we need a physical Parliament back, because there would not be any time for praying against statutory instruments if we weren't back. So I'm grateful to her for making my argument about the essential need for Parliament returning reasonably soon. As regards her constituent, I'm obviously sorry to hear about the difficulties her constituent is facing. I would point out that £11.1 billion is being paid out in furlough money and £7.5 billion in loans backed to 80% by the government, and that is major support for industry. I think the Chancellor has done a quite phenomenal amount in getting support to businesses, but I would happily take up the specific case with her, and likewise for the dentists in her constituency. I cannot claim to be an expert on the type of PPE that she is referring to, but I'm sure there are people in government who can get her a proper response.
I now go over to Gareth Johnson. Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during this lockdown, we have seen numerous cases of broadcast media interviewing people in a manner that suggests they are independent experts, whereas they are in fact partisan political activists. This, of course, culminated in the notorious Panorama programme last month, but there are many other examples. Can we therefore have a debate on the guidelines that broadcasters are meant to use so as to provide their viewers with an informed picture of what they're actually watching?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a really very important point, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, has written to the BBC asking for an explanation about that Panorama programme, which seemed to have communists in the background giving advice to how the programme was structured. I didn't realise there were any communists left in this country, but the BBC managed to dredge them up. And he's absolutely right to ask for a debate. Well, the right honourable lady heckles, Mr. Speaker. So unlike her, the right honourable lady normally say ladylike doesn't heckle, but I would say that yes, it's a free country, but the BBC is obliged to be impartial. It has charter obligations, and that the issue of a debate is that when the House is back in real form, there will be more opportunity for debates, more time for debates, which I hope will satisfy many honourable and right honourable members.
We now go to the SNP spokesperson, Thomas Shepherd, who's up to 2 minutes. Thomas Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me take up where I left off 25 minutes ago. I have still not had an answer as to whether the leader believes his proposals for Parliament's return are compatible with the equalities legislation of the United Kingdom, and I would like him to comment on that matter. But I have two further points, Mr. Speaker. The first is that we are told that Public Health England will again inspect the building during recess and advise on whether and how